Reverend Marcus Johnson lies bloodied on church steps in Oakwood, Alabama. Officer Derek Pearson stands over him, gun drawn, shouting racial slurs. The congregation watches in horror from the doorway. Despite the officer's threats, Marcus reaches for his phone with trembling fingers and makes one call while bleeding. "This is Reverend Johnson. Connect me to General Williams." The officer's face changes instantly as he hears the name. 20 minutes later, sirens approach not local police but black SUVs with government plates. You have no idea who you just assaulted, officer. What happens when decades of unchecked power and privilege suddenly crash against unexpected consequences? If you believe in justice and accountability, hit like and subscribe, because tomorrow's episode reveals how a single phone call can change an entire town's future. 3 days earlier, Reverend Marcus Johnson stood tall at the pulpit of Hope Baptist Church, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years of spiritual leadership in Oakwood, Alabama. At 62, his hair had grayed at the temples, but his eyes still held the fire of conviction that had guided his congregation through decades of hardship. A Vietnam veteran who earned a Purple Heart after saving 3 fellow soldiers under heavy fire, Marcus had served as a military chaplain before returning home to lead his community church. His friendship with General Williams began in those dark jungle days when a young Lieutenant Williams lay wounded, and Marcus stayed by his side through a night of enemy fire, praying and keeping him conscious until evacuation arrived. That bond, forged in war, had remained unbroken through the years. Few in Oakwood knew of Marcus's connections beyond their small town, seeing only the humble preacher who visited the sick, counseled troubled youth, and advocated for the community's needs with unwavering dedication. The recent police shooting of Jamal Davis, an unarmed 17-year-old black teenager during a routine traffic stop, had ignited tensions that had long simmered beneath Oakwood's surface. Marcus had comforted the grieving family, standing beside Jamal's mother at the hospital as she collapsed upon learning her son hadn't survived. He promised her that this time would be different, that this time the community would stand together for justice. The prayer vigil and peaceful march he organized was meant to be a moment of unity and healing, a chance for Oakwood to begin reconciliation. But Marcus hadn't anticipated the resistance he would face at the permit office. Officer Derek Pearson sat behind the desk, his expression hardening as Marcus explained the purpose of the gathering. "Prayer vigil? Sounds like a protest to me, Reverend," he said, deliberately setting the application aside. "We've got procedures for these things." Marcus maintained his composure, explaining patiently that all the proper documentation was included. "We're exercising our constitutional rights to peaceful assembly and religious expression, Officer Pearson. The application meets all requirements." Derek glanced at the paperwork without really reading it. "Well, there's a backlog. Might take a couple weeks to process." The vigil was planned for 2 days later, and both men knew it. What began as subtle obstruction soon transformed into overt disrespect as Derek called a colleague over. "Hey, got another one of these prayer meetings from the Baptist church. Think we should expedite it?" His exaggerated air quotes and smirk made his contempt clear. Marcus felt the sting of humiliation but refused to show it. He'd experienced this his entire life, being made to feel less than, being forced to justify his existence and his rights. Even in his clerical collar, even with his military service, even with his decades of community work, to some he would always be seen as nothing more than his skin color. "I can wait while you process it now, officer," Marcus said calmly. "The law requires you to process peaceful assembly permits within 24 hours when they meet all criteria." Derek's face tightened. He hadn't expected the Reverend to know the exact regulations. "You threatening me with legal action, Reverend?" "Not at all," Marcus replied. "I'm simply stating facts. We both want to follow proper procedures, don't we?" The standoff lasted nearly 3 hours, with Marcus refusing to leave without the permit. Community members, seeing their pastor waiting, began gathering outside the municipal building. Phone calls were made. By late afternoon, the mayor's office had intervened, and the permit was grudgingly issued. As Marcus finally walked out with the approved document, Derek called after him. "Don't expect special treatment at your little Prayer circle, Reverend. We'll be watching. Marcus simply nodded, but inside he felt a deep unease. Something in Derek's eyes suggested this confrontation was far from over. What Marcus couldn't know was how deeply his quiet dignity had infected Derek with resentment, or how the connections Marcus had cultivated through decades of service would soon become his strongest shield in the coming storm. Derek Pearson came from a long line of Oakwood police officers. His grandfather had patrolled these streets with a nightstick during segregation. His father and uncle had been on the force when civil rights marches came through in the 60s. The Pearson name commanded respect in certain circles in Oakwood, circles that still gathered at private hunting lodges and backyard barbecues where casual racism flowed as freely as beer. At 38, Derek was a third-generation officer who had absorbed the family's unspoken code: protect your own, maintain order, and remember who really runs this town. His personnel file contained 7 excessive force complaints in 11 years, all filed by black citizens, all dismissed without serious investigation. Each complaint had only strengthened his position within the department, earning backslaps and assurances that he was doing what needed to be done to keep Oakwood safe. Police Chief Walter Simmons had been his father's partner and was Derek's godfather. When the latest complaint crossed his desk after Derek had roughed up a teenager for looking suspicious outside a convenience store, Simmons had called him in for a closed-door meeting. "You need to be more careful about witnesses, son," was his only admonishment. The protection network extended beyond the police department. The mayor counted on the police union's support during elections. The district attorney needed police cooperation to maintain his conviction rate. The local judge who handled most police misconduct cases had been endorsed by the police union for 20 years. It was a system designed to protect itself, with Derek as both beneficiary and enforcer. He had watched Reverend Johnson for years with growing resentment. The pastor represented everything Derek despised: a black man respected by both races, a moral authority who couldn't be intimidated, someone who spoke about justice and was actually listened to. When the Davis boy had been shot by Officer Reynolds, Derek had privately congratulated his colleague. "One less troublemaker," he'd said at the bar frequented by officers. But now Johnson was organizing this vigil, bringing attention to Oakwood, potentially disrupting the careful balance of power they'd maintained for generations. The night after the permit confrontation, Derek called a meeting at his hunting cabin outside town. 6 officers gathered, all members of what they jokingly called the real police force of Oakwood. "Johnson's getting too big for his britches," Derek told them, passing around beers. "This vigil is going to bring outside agitators and media. We need to control the situation." Officer Rayburn, a younger recruit eager to prove himself, suggested they could find something on Johnson. "Everyone's got dirt. We could run his plates, check for outstanding tickets, maybe plant something if necessary." Chief Simmons, who had joined them later, shook his head. "Nothing that obvious. Johnson's too smart, too connected. We need to maintain plausible deniability." The plan they developed was more subtle security protocols that would make the vigil as uncomfortable as possible, selective enforcement of noise ordinances and gathering permits, and a visible police presence to intimidate participants. "I'll volunteer to handle security," Derek said. "I want to see Johnson's face when he realizes he's not running the show." As they left the cabin, Chief Simmons pulled Derek aside. "Don't let this get personal, Derek. Johnson pushes your buttons. I've seen it." But it was already personal. In Derek's mind, Marcus Johnson represented a challenge to everything he believed about how the world should work. What he couldn't articulate even to himself was the fear beneath his anger. Fear that men like Johnson might succeed in changing Oakwood, might expose the system that had protected him his entire career, might force a reckoning with truths he wasn't prepared to face. Would you stand against injustice if you knew the system was rigged against you? Or would you stay silent to protect yourself and your family? Comment number 1: if you believe speaking truth to power is always worth the risk, even when the consequences could be severe. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that systems of oppression depend on good people remaining silent. And ask yourself, what would you risk to challenge generations of entrenched corruption? The day before the vigil, Marcus arrived at Hope Baptist Church to find an envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a crudely drawn image of a lynching with the words, "History repeats," scrawled beneath it. He quietly removed it before any congregation members could see, but it wasn't the only message delivered that day. By noon, 3 more threatening notes had appeared, each more explicit than the last. The church janitor discovered the word agitator spray-painted across the back entrance, still wet in the morning sun. Marcus reported each incident to the police, speaking directly to the desk sergeant rather than filing reports that might cross Derek's desk. "We'll look into it, Reverend," was the non-committal response each time. Late that afternoon, Marcus discovered all 4 tires on his sedan had been slashed in the church parking lot. As he stood there considering his options, Sister Gladys Jackson, a 70-year-old church elder, approached him with tears in her eyes. "Reverend, my grandson doesn't want me to come tomorrow. Says it's not safe." Marcus took her weathered hands in his. "Sister Jackson, fear is the tool they've always used against us, but we will gather in peace, pray in strength, and walk with dignity. I promise you no harm will come to our congregation on my watch." But as members of his congregation called throughout the day expressing similar concerns, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. When his daughter Aisha arrived from Atlanta that evening, she brought her legal expertise and fierce protectiveness. At 34, she had become a respected civil rights attorney, fighting many of the same battles her father had faced, though with legal briefs rather than scripture. "Dad, this doesn't feel right," she said, examining the slashed tires. "These aren't just scare tactics, someone's escalating." They sat at his kitchen table, the same one where he'd helped her with homework 20 years earlier, now covered with permit documents and safety plans for the vigil. "I've reached out to some colleagues at the Southern Lawyers Committee," she continued. "They're sending observers tomorrow, and I've contacted media outlets in Birmingham and Atlanta." Marcus nodded. "Good. Witnesses and documentation are our protection." What he didn't tell her was that he'd made another call as well. Late that night, after Aisha had gone to bed in her childhood room, Marcus sat in his study and dialed a number few people knew he had. "General Williams? Marcus Johnson here. No emergency, just checking in. Things are a bit tense in Oakwood right now." They spoke for nearly an hour, 2 old friends reminiscing about shared history, while carefully addressing current concerns. "So you still have that favor I owe you, Marcus," the general said before hanging up. "After 40 years, I haven't forgotten." "Let's hope we never need to call it in," Marcus replied. Outside, parked at the corner with headlights off, Derek Pearson and Officer Rayburn watched the lights in the Johnson home. "His daughter's visiting," Rayburn reported. "The civil rights lawyer from Atlanta." Derek scowled. "Perfect. Another troublemaker." He took a long swig from his coffee cup, which contained more bourbon than coffee. "Johnson thinks he's protected because people respect him. Tomorrow he learns that respect doesn't count for much when you step out of line." Morning broke clear and warm over Oakwood as people began gathering at Hope Baptist Church. Marcus stood at the entrance, greeting each arrival with a handshake or embrace, his clerical collar stark white against his dark suit. By 9 o'clock, nearly 300 people filled the church and spilled onto the lawn, church members, community supporters, and a surprising number of white allies from neighboring communities. Derek Pearson and 8 officers had established a perimeter, setting up metal detectors and checkpoints that created unnecessary bottlenecks. "For your safety," Derek announced with a smile that never reached his eyes, as elderly church members were made to empty their purses and young men were subjected to pat-downs. A group of white supporters from the Methodist Church across town found themselves waved through with minimal checking, while black attendees faced intense scrutiny. Marcus observed the deliberate harassment without comment, instead focusing on maintaining the day's peaceful atmosphere. "Remember why we're here," he told a group of frustrated young men who had been made to wait nearly an hour. "This is exactly what they want to provoke an angry response. Our dignity is our strongest protest." Inside the packed church, the air conditioning struggled against the heat of too many bodies. Journalists from local stations positioned cameras as Marcus took his place at the pulpit. His sermon that morning transcended the immediate tensions, speaking to the heart of a community in pain while offering a vision of reconciliation. We gather not in anger, though we have cause. We gather not in vengeance, though we have suffered. We gather in the radical tradition of love that has sustained our people through centuries of struggle. His voice rose and fell, carrying decades of practiced oratory. Jamal Davis should be sitting with his mother today, dreaming about college, about his future. Instead, she sits before us in grief. Our march today is not just for Jamal. It's for a future where no mother fears for her child's life during a traffic stop. As amens echoed through the sanctuary, Derek paced outside, increasingly agitated by the growing crowd and media presence. When the service concluded and people began organizing for the march, he implemented the next phase of harassment. All banners must be inspected, he announced, confiscating several hand-painted signs bearing Jamal's image and messages about justice. Tensions escalated when Derek roughly grabbed a banner from 17-year-old Darius Williams, a church choir member. This could conceal a weapon, he claimed, tearing the cloth. Marcus intervened, stepping between Derek and the teenager. "Officer Pearson, you know these are peaceful churchgoers exercising their constitutional rights." Derek stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over Marcus. "You backing an attitude problem, Reverend?" This boy was resisting. "I was just holding my sign, sir," Darius protested. "You just grabbed it." Derek's hand moved to his baton. "You calling me a liar, boy?" The confrontation had drawn attention, with several phone cameras now recording. Marcus placed a gentle hand on Darius's shoulder. "Son, please join the gathering. Line, I'll handle this." Once the young man had moved away, Marcus spoke quietly to Derek. "Whatever personal issue you have with me, leave these people out of it. They've done nothing wrong." "That's where you're mistaken, Reverend," Derek replied, his voice low and venomous. "Stirring up trouble, making our town look bad, turning people against the police, that's plenty wrong in my book." Despite the officer's intimidation, the march proceeded with powerful dignity. 500 people ultimately walked the 12 blocks from the church to the courthouse, singing hymns and carrying photos of Jamal Davis and other victims of police violence. News cameras captured the solemn procession, including the stark visual of armed officers flanking peaceful marchers. Marcus led with Jamal's mother beside him, her grief-stricken face a silent testimony more powerful than any speech. When they returned to the church, the sense of accomplishment was palpable. They had been seen. They had made their statement without giving opponents any excuse for escalation. Even local white residents who had watched from sidewalks seemed moved by the dignity of the demonstration. But as Marcus watched Derek conferring with other officers, their expressions dark with thwarted anger, he knew the day's success had only deepened the officers' resentment. What he couldn't know was how quickly that resentment would transform into dangerous action. Have you ever witnessed someone abuse their power and felt helpless to stop them? Comment number 1 if you've experienced or witnessed discrimination from those sworn to protect and serve. Hit like and subscribe if you believe community solidarity is the greatest defense against injustice. The question remains, when peaceful protest meets entrenched power, who really controls what happens next? The sanctuary stood empty, as evening shadows lengthened across the pews. After the successful march, congregation members had departed with renewed hope, carrying the day's energy back to their homes and neighborhoods. Marcus remained alone in his office, completing paperwork for the church's community outreach programs. The day's events had been powerful, but he knew that sustainable change required more than marches. It needed infrastructure, resources, and persistent advocacy. The sound of the side door opening broke his concentration. Heavy footsteps echoed through the quiet building, not the familiar tread of the janitor or a church deacon, but the deliberate cadence of someone making an entrance. "Church is closed for the evening," Marcus called out, rising from his desk. 3 figures appeared in his doorway. Officer Derek Pearson, flanked by 2 uniformed colleagues. None had removed their caps in the sanctuary, a small but deliberate discourtesy. "This isn't a social call, Reverend," Derek announced, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. "We have information that your church has been harboring protest organizers from outside the county." Marcus maintained his composure, though his heart raced. "Officer Pearson, this is a house of worship. We don't harbor anyone. Our doors are open to all who seek communion with God or community with their neighbors." "Save the sermon," Derek cut him off. "We have reliable information that your peaceful prayer vigil was organized by professional agitators." He made a show of looking around the office. "We'll need to search the premises." Marcus moved to stand in the office doorway. "Do you have a warrant, Officer Pearson? Because without one, you have no legal right to search church property." Derek's face hardened. "Obstruction of justice is a serious charge, Reverend. Are you refusing to cooperate with police?" "I'm asserting the constitutional rights of this church and its congregation," Marcus replied evenly. "If you have legitimate concerns, I'm happy to address them through proper legal channels." The younger officers shifted uncomfortably, but Derek stepped forward until he was inches from Marcus's face. "You think you're untouchable because you wear that collar? You think the rules don't apply to you people?" Marcus didn't flinch. "The rules apply to everyone, officer, including police officers who enter private property without warrants." Derek's control snapped. He shoved Marcus hard, sending the older man stumbling backward. "I'm sick of your self-righteous attitude. You've been stirring up trouble in my town for too long." Marcus regained his balance, straightening his glasses. "This isn't your town, Officer Pearson. It belongs to all its citizens." Derek lunged forward again, this time grabbing Marcus by his shirt front and dragging him from the office. The other officers watched in stunned silence as their colleague manhandled a respected 62-year-old minister. "Derek, maybe we should—" one began, but Derek silenced him with a glare. "You want to file a report saying you were too afraid to search for evidence because a preacher quoted the Constitution at you." He pushed Marcus toward the sanctuary exit. "We're going to have a conversation outside, Reverend, man to man." Marcus felt the danger escalating but maintained his dignity. "I have nothing to say to you that I haven't already said, Officer Pearson. I ask that you leave church property immediately." As they reached the top of the church steps, Derek shoved again harder. Whether he intended Marcus to fall or merely to intimidate him wasn't clear, but the result was catastrophic. Marcus lost his footing and tumbled down the concrete steps, his aging body offering little protection against the sharp edges. He landed at the bottom with a sickening thud, blood immediately pooling beneath his head. While Marcus lay stunned and bleeding, Derek turned to his shocked colleagues. He became combative and fell while resisting detention. "That's what happened. Understood?" The younger officers stared in horror at the injured Reverend. Derek rushed back into the church, returning moments later with a can of spray paint confiscated from the march. He quickly planted it inside, then hurried down the steps, delivering a vicious kick to Marcus's ribs. "Found your evidence, agitator." He spat loud enough for his colleagues to hear. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" As Marcus struggled to remain conscious, congregation members who had been returning for evening Bible study witnessed the scene. Sister Jackson screamed, while Deacon Phillips immediately began recording with his phone. "Police brutality! He's assaulting Reverend Johnson!" Derek whirled around, hand moving to his weapon. "Stay back, this is police business!" More church members arrived, forming a semicircle of horrified witnesses. Phones recorded as Derek shouted racial slurs and threats, his composure completely abandoned. "Any of you move closer, you're going to jail. This race-baiting preacher is under arrest." Through the haze of pain, Marcus reached for his phone, which had fallen from his pocket during the fall. With trembling fingers, he dialed a number he'd memorized decades ago but had never used. "This is Reverend Johnson," he managed to say through bloodied lips. "Connect me to General Williams." The name carried across the shocked silence, causing Derek to freeze mid-tirade. "It's an emergency," Marcus continued, his voice strengthening, despite his injuries. "At Hope Baptist Church, Oakwood, Alabama," he met Derek's suddenly uncertain gaze. "Tell him Officer Derek Pearson just assaulted me on church property without provocation or warrant. Tell him I'm invoking the promise." 20 minutes that felt like hours passed, with Marcus lying on the ground, the congregation prevented from approaching him by Derek's increasingly desperate threats. In the distance, sirens wailed, not the familiar sound of local police cruisers, but the distinctive approach of multiple vehicles moving in coordination. Black SUVs with government plates swung into the church driveway, disgorging men and women in tactical gear bearing federal insignia. "Federal agents, everyone stand down." A tall black man in a colonel's uniform approached with purposeful strides. "Secure the officer," he ordered, and two agents immediately moved to Derek's side. As they reached for his weapon, Derek backed away. "This is local police jurisdiction. You have no authority here." "I have every authority here, Officer Pearson," the colonel replied coldly. "You have no idea who you just assaulted." Within minutes, the church grounds had transformed into a secure perimeter under federal control. Colonel James Richardson knelt beside Marcus, now receiving medical attention from a military medic. "Reverend Johnson, the general sends his regards, and apologies for not coming himself. He's en route by helicopter and will be here within the hour." Marcus nodded weakly, wincing as the medic examined his injuries. "Thank you, Colonel. Please ensure no harm comes to my congregation." Derek. Pearson stood handcuffed between two federal agents, his face a mask of confusion and growing fear. "This is illegal detention of a police officer. I was responding to evidence of criminal activity." The colonel ignored him, instead directing his team to secure the scene and collect evidence. Church members who had witnessed the assault were being interviewed by federal agents, their cell phone footage transferred to official devices. The flashing lights of local police cruisers appeared as Police Chief Walter Simmons arrived, striding toward the scene with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every situation in Oakwood. "What in God's name is going on here?" he demanded, badge extended. "This is Oakwood Police jurisdiction. Who authorized federal presence?" Colonel Richardson straightened to his full height, unimpressed. "Colonel James Richardson, Joint Special Operations Command, attached to the office of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. We're securing a crime scene involving the assault of a civilian with Level 1 federal protected status." The police chief faltered. "Level 1, what are you talking about? This is Marcus Johnson, the local Baptist preacher." "This," Colonel Richardson corrected, "is Reverend Dr. Marcus Johnson, recipient of the Purple Heart and Bronze Star with Valor, former special advisor to the Joint Chiefs, and spiritual counselor to 3 consecutive presidents." The revelation sent a ripple of astonishment through the gathered crowd. Marcus had never spoken of such connections, never leveraged his national relationships for local standing. "Additionally," the colonel continued, "Reverend Johnson has served as a special diplomatic envoy during multiple confidential peace negotiations overseas, where his religious credentials provided essential cover for sensitive operations." "Chief," Simmons's face drained of color, "there must be some mistake. My officer was responding to a legitimate complaint." The distant thrum of helicopter rotors cut him off as a military chopper descended toward the church's adjacent field. The crowd parted as a distinguished man in a general's uniform strode purposefully toward Marcus. General David Williams, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, knelt beside his old friend with genuine concern. "Marcus, you stubborn fool. 40 years of friendship and you wait until you're bleeding to finally call in that favor." Despite his pain, Marcus managed a weak smile. "Didn't want to abuse the connection, David." The general clasped his hand. "This isn't about connection. This is about justice." He stood, surveying the scene with the practiced eye of a career military strategist. When his gaze fell on Derek Pearson, it hardened to steel. "Is this the officer?" Derek's prior confidence had evaporated completely. He looked desperately to Chief Simmons for support, but the police chief had strategically distanced himself, suddenly preoccupied with his radio. "General, sir," Derek attempted, military address emerging from some long-buried respect for authority. "There's been a misunderstanding. The Reverend fell during a legitimate police investigation. We have 17 civilian witnesses and multiple video recordings that say otherwise, Officer Pearson," Colonel Richardson interrupted, "including the church's security cameras, which captured the entire incident in high definition." This news struck Derek like a physical blow. He hadn't noticed the discreet security system Marcus had installed after previous vandalism incidents. Every moment of the confrontation, every racial slur, every fabricated accusation, had been recorded. A medical evacuation team arrived to transport Marcus to the regional medical center. As they prepared him for transport, his daughter, Aisha, pushed through the crowd, her face contorted with anguish at the sight of her father's injuries. "Dad, oh my God, Dad!" She fell to her knees beside the stretcher, grasping his hand. Marcus squeezed back weakly. "I'm all right, baby girl. The truth is being revealed now." General Williams placed a gentle hand on Aisha's shoulder. "Ms. Johnson, I've arranged for the best trauma team in the region. Your father will receive excellent care." She looked up at him, recognition dawning. "You're David, from his Vietnam stories." The general nodded. "Your father saved my life. I've never forgotten." As Marcus was loaded into the ambulance, news. Vans began arriving, not just local affiliates, but national networks alerted to the dramatic confrontation between local police and federal authorities in a small Alabama town. The story was spreading rapidly. A respected black pastor with hidden connections to the highest levels of government, assaulted on church steps by a police officer with a history of racial animus. Derek Pearson, still handcuffed between federal agents, watched his world collapsing. The system of protection that had sheltered him throughout his career had suddenly evaporated, leaving him exposed. Chief Simmons had retreated to his vehicle, already calculating how to distance the department from what was clearly becoming a national scandal. The evidence secured church surveillance footage, witness statements, and the planted spray paint can with only Derek's fingerprints ensured the first wave of consequences would be swift and inescapable. As Marcus's ambulance pulled away, the crowd of congregation members began singing Amazing Grace, their voices rising in the twilight. The general stood at attention, a silent tribute to his old friend's courage. What had begun as a local confrontation had exploded into something much larger, a moment of reckoning, not just for Derek Pearson but for the entire power structure of Oakwood. Have you ever witnessed the moment when someone realizes their actions finally have consequences? Comment number 1. If you believe that true justice requires accountability at all levels of society, regardless of badge or position. Like and subscribe if you understand that sometimes the most powerful people are those whose power remains hidden until absolutely necessary. The question now hanging over Oakwood, when decades of protected corruption suddenly faces exposure, who else might be implicated in the coming storm? 3 days after the assault, Marcus Johnson lay in a private hospital room, his body a catalogue of injuries. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, a fractured wrist, and dozens of contusions. Aisha had barely left his side, converting half the room into a makeshift legal office as she coordinated with federal prosecutors. The local news cycled continuous coverage of the incident, with leaked security footage showing Derek Pearson's assault playing on every channel. But beneath the apparent victory, a concerning pattern was emerging. Derek Pearson had been released on bail within 24 hours of his arrest, his bond posted by the police union's legal defense fund. Despite federal interest in the case, local jurisdiction still applied for the initial charges, and Judge William Harmon, a long-time beneficiary of police union support, had been assigned to the preliminary hearing. "They're already working the system," Aisha told her father, reviewing documents on her laptop. "The police unions released a statement saying you became combative and aggressive during a legitimate investigation." Marcus shifted painfully in the hospital bed. "Truth has witnesses, Aisha. This time they can't bury it." But the counteroffensive was just beginning. That afternoon, Marcus's longtime church secretary called in tears. "Reverend, someone broke into the church office. The computer with the security video backup is gone, and they're saying the original footage has been corrupted in police evidence storage." Similar troubling developments multiplied throughout the week. Congregation members who had witnessed the assault reported intimidating late-night drive-bys at their homes. 2 had their car windows smashed with notes warning, "Snitches, get stitches." When Aisha returned to her father's home to collect fresh clothes, she found her rental car vandalized with racial slurs and threats spray-painted across the hood. "Race traitor lawyers die first." The threat was photographed by federal agents, now protecting the Johnson residence, but local police responded with suspicious tardiness. Just kids causing trouble, the responding officer suggested, barely glancing at the explicit death threat. The institutional pushback escalated when Police Chief Simmons called a press conference on the steps of the Oakwood Municipal Building. Standing before a wall of uniformed officers, he delivered a carefully crafted narrative. Officer Pearson is a decorated public servant with an exemplary record who responded to credible reports of illegal activity. While we regret Reverend Johnson's injuries resulting from his unfortunate fall, we categorically reject any characterization of this incident as racially motivated. The assembled officers nodded in solidarity. Furthermore, Simmons continued, we question the timing and political nature of federal involvement in a local police matter. Reverend Johnson's previously undisclosed connections to Washington power brokers suggest a political agenda that merits further scrutiny. The implications were clear. Marcus was being portrayed as an outside agitator with suspicious government ties, rather than a respected community leader defending his congregation's rights. That evening, another blow struck. The church community, center where after-school programs served low-income families, erupted in flames, the fire spreading with suspicious speed. By the time fire crews controlled the blaze, the building was gutted. The fire marshal's preliminary report noted multiple points of origin, but stopped short of declaring arson. As Marcus watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, he felt the weight of consequences falling not on Derek Pearson, but on the community Marcus had sworn to protect. They're punishing the congregation to get to me, he told Aisha, his voice tight with pain that wasn't entirely physical. Children have lost their safe space. Families have lost resources they depend on. For the first time since the assault, doubt clouded his features. Maybe I should have handled this differently. Aisha took his hand firmly. Dad, this is exactly why you couldn't back down. They've operated this way for decades because no one could stand against them. But you're not alone now. Marcus closed his eyes, drawing on the faith that had sustained him through combat, through civil rights struggles, through countless personal battles. You're right. If they're fighting back this hard, it means they're afraid. The truth is threatening. The entire system that's protected them. He opened his eyes with renewed resolve. It's time to fight back through every proper channel, not for vengeance but for justice that heals our community. What he didn't yet realize was how deep the corruption ran, or how desperate Oakwood's power brokers would become as their foundations began to crumble. General Williams hadn't reached his position by leaving matters to chance. From his office in the Pentagon, he activated a network of connections built over 4 decades of military service. A discreet call to the Attorney General, an old classmate, from West Point, set wheels in motion within the Justice Department. By the following morning, the Civil Rights Division had officially opened an investigation into patterns and practices of the Oakwood Police Department. The FBI field office in Birmingham received authorization to deploy additional agents to Oakwood, their presence impossible to miss in the small town as they established a temporary command center in the federal building. This isn't just about one incident, the lead FBI investigator explained to Aisha during a confidential briefing. We've had Oakwood on our radar for possible civil rights violations for some time. Your father's case gives us the leverage to conduct a comprehensive investigation. The scope of federal interest became clear when agents arrived at the police department with warrants for employment records, internal affairs files, and complete access to the department's computer systems. Chief Simmons protested vehemently, but the federal warrants overrode his objections. As technicians began imaging police servers, officers watched in stunned silence, the invulnerability they had long felt suddenly evaporating. The investigation expanded rapidly, with FBI agents conducting interviews throughout Oakwood, focusing particularly on patterns of racial discrimination in policing. Decades of complaints that had disappeared into administrative black holes were now being examined by investigators with federal authority and resources. Marcus followed these developments from his hospital room, now guarded by federal agents. Though he approved of the investigation, he was troubled by its implications. I never wanted this to become a federal takeover, he confided to General Williams during a visit. This is our town. We need to heal it ourselves. The general understood his friend's concerns. The investigation creates space for that healing. Marcus, it removes the immediate threat while the community finds its voice. Evidence of that growing voice appeared that same day, when Derek Pearson's personnel file was leaked to the media, revealing a disturbing history of excessive force complaints and racist comments that had been systematically buried by department leadership. Public opinion, initially divided along racial lines, began shifting as white residents confronted documented evidence of misconduct. 3 days later, Police Chief Simmons was placed on administrative leave pending investigation of his role in covering up civil rights violations. The acting chief, a recently promoted captain with less connection to the old guard, publicly committed to cooperation with federal investigators. The mayor, sensing political winds shifting, called an emergency town council meeting to address the situation. "The integrity of our community must be our highest priority," he announced, carefully distancing himself from the police leadership he had supported for years. Oakwood commits to a full accounting and necessary reforms. While local officials scrambled to position themselves, Marcus received an unexpected call from Washington. "Reverend Johnson, please hold for the President of the United States." The conversation that followed was brief but significant. The President expressed personal concern about the incident and offered federal resources for rebuilding the community center. "Your service to this country hasn't been forgotten," the President assured him. Marcus appreciated the support, but declined special intervention. "Mr. President, I believe in our system of justice when properly applied. I ask only that the standard process be allowed to work without interference for or against any party." After the call, Marcus reflected on the strange ironies of his situation. For decades he had worked quietly within the system, building bridges and seeking incremental change. Now that system was being shaken to its foundations, because someone had pushed him down a flight of stairs. The power he had never sought to use had been activated by a single act of violence against him. Yet even as federal pressure mounted on Oakwood's institutions, Marcus worried about the counterforces gathering in response. Derek Pearson remained free on bail, his presence in town a constant reminder that powerful interests still protected him. The police union had hired a prominent defense attorney, known for winning excessive force cases, and local television featured sympathetic interviews with officers describing the impossible conditions they worked under. Though Marcus couldn't know it yet, these public maneuvers were merely a distraction from more dangerous developments, occurring behind closed-doors developments that would soon threaten everything he had worked to build. Have you ever wondered how differently justice operates depending on who you know? Comment number 1. If you believe connections should never determine the quality of justice a person receives. Hit like and subscribe if you think that systemic change requires both outside pressure and community healing. As federal investigators dig deeper into Oakwood's history, what secrets might be uncovered that powerful people have kept hidden for generations? And when a system built on protection and privilege begins to crumble, how far will those who benefited go to preserve their advantage? The FBI investigation into Oakwood's police department began with Derek Pearson's assault on Marcus Johnson, but quickly expanded into something far more comprehensive. Agents examining police records discovered patterns that couldn't be explained by individual misconduct. Systematic evidence tampering in cases involving black defendants, disproportionate traffic stops in predominantly black neighborhoods, and a municipal court system that imposed higher fines and harsher sentences based on race and neighborhood. We're seeing a revenue-generating system built on targeted enforcement, the lead FBI investigator told Aisha as they reviewed preliminary findings. Traffic tickets, court fees, probation costs, all disproportionately extracted from black residents. The investigation uncovered financial improprieties that extended beyond the police department. Municipal court judges had been dismissing cases against certain defendants while maximizing penalties against others, with clear racial patterns. City contracts had been awarded to companies with connections to police leadership. Evidence lockers contained unexplained gaps in documentation for cash and valuables seized during arrests. As federal agents methodically built their case, Derek Pearson watched his protection network disintegrating. Former allies avoided him. The police union representatives stopped returning his calls. Chief Simmons, himself under investigation, sent a clear message through intermediaries: "You're on your own." Fear drove Derek to desperate measures. Late one night, he packed essential belongings into his truck and attempted to leave town, planning to cross state lines into Mississippi, where his uncle owned property. He made it halfway to the county line before federal agents pulled him over. His movements had been monitored since his release on bail, a standard procedure in civil rights cases. His attempted flight resulted in his bail being revoked, and Derek found himself in federal custody, held without possibility of release until trial. Meanwhile, Aisha Johnson had been conducting her own investigation. As a civil rights attorney, she had connections to advocacy organizations throughout the South. Working with these networks, she began collecting testimonials from former Oakwood residents who had moved away after experiencing police harassment. The pattern extended back decades, connecting current officers to a history of intimidation that had systematically driven out black residents who attempted to challenge local authority. Her most disturbing discovery came when a data analyst friend helped her cross-reference police department employment records with membership lists from known hate groups that had been leaked online years earlier. The overlap was undeniable. Several current and former Oakwood officers, including Derek's father, appeared on rosters of organizations with explicit white supremacist ideologies. "Dad, this goes deeper than we thought," she told Marcus during a hospital visit. "The department hasn't just been protecting individual officers. It's been a deliberate system of control and intimidation for generations." Marcus had been released from the hospital, but remained under medical care at home, his injuries healing slowly. "Be careful with this information, Aisha. The more you uncover, the more dangerous this becomes for you." His warning proved prophetic that same night. As Aisha worked late in her father's study, compiling evidence for federal prosecutors, she heard a noise at the back door. When she investigated, a masked figure lunged at her from the darkness. Only the timely intervention of a federal agent posted outside prevented what might have been a deadly attack. The assailant escaped, but dropped a police-issued tactical flashlight in the struggle. The message was clear: someone within the department wanted to silence her investigation before she could share her findings. The community rallied in response to the attack. Volunteers organized a security rotation for the Johnson home, with cars parked outside around the clock. Marcus's white allies from neighboring churches made a point of maintaining visible presence, understanding that their privilege provided an additional layer of protection. When Aisha presented her evidence connecting department members to hate groups, federal investigators moved quickly to secure additional records before they could be destroyed. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. What had begun as an inquiry into a single assault had expanded to reveal a decades-long conspiracy of corruption, racial targeting, and civil rights violations that implicated dozens of current and former officials. For Derek Pearson, watching from detention as the case expanded beyond him, the realization finally dawned that he had been merely a symptom of a diseased system, one that had raised him to believe in his impunity while setting him up to take the fall when that system was threatened. But even as federal authorities closed in on the broader conspiracy, the most dangerous elements of Oakwood's corrupt power structure were making their final, desperate plans, not just to escape justice, but to exact revenge on those who had exposed them. Marcus Johnson sat alone in the visitation room of the Federal Detention Center, his Bible open on the table before him. The injuries from his fall had begun to heal, though he still moved carefully to protect his fractured ribs. The door opened, and Derek Pearson entered, shuffling in restraints. Gone was the arrogant officer who had assaulted him on the church steps. This Derek Pearson looked diminished, his uniform replaced by a jumpsuit, his confident swagger reduced to a hesitant approach. Guards positioned themselves at the door as Derek took a seat across from Marcus. "I didn't expect you to come," Derek said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "My lawyer said you requested this meeting." "I did," Marcus confirmed. "Not for my sake, but for yours." Derek's expression hardened momentarily, a flash of his former self. "I don't need your forgiveness, Reverend." "I didn't come to offer forgiveness yet," Marcus replied calmly. I came because every soul deserves the chance to find their way back to righteousness, even yours. For nearly an hour they sat together in that sterile room. Marcus spoke not of the case against Derek, but of deeper matters, of how hatred corrodes the soul that harbors it, of how systems of injustice ultimately fail those who enforce them as well as those they oppress. At first, Derek remained defensive, clinging to the justifications that had defined his worldview. But as Marcus continued, something in the officer began to crack. "I never had a choice," Derek said finally, his voice breaking. "My father was on the force, his father before him. From the time I was old enough to understand anything, I was taught who belonged where in Oakwood. I was taught who to protect and who to control." "There is always choice, Derek," Marcus responded. "The hardest choices are when we must break from the path laid out for us by those we love." "My father took me to my first clan meeting when I was 14, Derek confessed, tears now flowing freely. "Said it was part of my heritage, my duty to preserve the natural order. I didn't question it. I never questioned any of it." As Derek spoke, decades of indoctrination poured out the family dinners, where racial slurs were as common as table salt, the police academy where selective enforcement was taught through knowing glances and coded language, the system of mutual protection that ensured complaints from black citizens never gained traction. Marcus listened without judgment, recognizing in Derek's confession the architecture of systemic racism that had shaped Oakwood for generations. When they finally parted, Derek paused at the door. "Why would you come here? After what I did to you?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Because change begins with truth, Derek. Your truth may help heal Oakwood if you have the courage to speak it." News of Marcus's visit to Derek spread quickly through the community, creating unexpected controversy. Outside the church that Sunday, several congregation members protested with signs reading, "No forgiveness without justice," and "Accountability first." Inside, the sanctuary was divided. Many understood Marcus's spiritual obligation to minister, even to those who had harmed him, while others felt his visit sent the wrong message about consequences for racial violence. Aisha struggled most visibly with her father's decision. "He nearly killed you, Dad," she argued as they prepared for service. "And now the congregation is torn apart because you rushed to offer him spiritual comfort before justice has even been served." Marcus straightened his clerical collar, wincing slightly at the movement. "I didn't offer him comfort, Aisha. I offered him truth. There's a difference." She shook her head in frustration. "The optics matter. People are watching everything. We do right now." "They certainly are," Marcus agreed. "Which is why I needed to demonstrate that our struggle is not against Derek Pearson the man, but against the system that created and empowered him." His sermon that morning addressed the controversy directly. Standing before his divided congregation, Marcus spoke with the moral clarity that had defined his ministry for decades. "Justice and mercy are not opposing forces," he told them. "They are complementary aspects of God's love. We can demand accountability through the justice system while still recognizing the humanity of those who have harmed us." He looked out at the skeptical faces, understanding their pain and anger. The system that protected Officer Pearson must be dismantled. The practices that allowed his actions must be reformed. But if we lose our capacity for compassion in that process, we become diminished by the very struggle that should elevate us. The congregation remained divided, but Marcus had created space for an essential conversation, not just about Derek Pearson, but about justice, reconciliation, and the path forward for Oakwood. Meanwhile, the Justice Department announced sweeping indictments against 8 current and former Oakwood police officers, including Police Chief Simmons. The charges ranged from civil rights violations to conspiracy, evidence tampering, and corruption. Federal agents arrested the indicted officers in coordinated early morning raids, a show of force that signaled the seriousness of the prosecution. As Chief Simmons was led from his home in handcuffs, neighbors who had once deferred to his authority watched in stunned silence. The system of protection that had prevailed in Oakwood for generations was crumbling, but its fall would not come without a final desperate resistance. The indictments sent shockwaves through Oakwood's power structure. As federal prosecutors presented their case to the public, The extent of corruption within the police department became impossible to ignore. Evidence of systematic harassment, falsified reports and financial malfeasance painted a damning picture of institutional racism enforced through badge and gun. For the first time, many white residents began to understand what their black neighbors had experienced for generations. "We never knew it was this bad," became a common refrain, met with weary recognition from those who had tried to tell them. For years, while public opinion shifted, Marcus and his family faced escalating threats. Anonymous calls came at all hours. Crude notes appeared on the Johnson family doorstep. Federal protection remained in place, but the atmosphere of menace grew more pronounced as the prosecutions advanced. 3 weeks after the indictments, the threats materialized in terrifying form. Shortly after midnight, several gunshots shattered the windows of Marcus's home. Aisha, who had been working late in the living room, was struck by flying glass, sustaining cuts to her face and arms as she dove for cover. The federal agent posted outside returned fire, but the attackers escaped in a waiting vehicle. As paramedics treated Aisha's injuries, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone. "We're not leaving Oakwood," he announced to the FBI agents, who suggested relocation until the trials concluded. "This is our home. If we leave under threat, others who speak up will face the same intimidation without our resources or protection." Instead, the community formed what they called a shield of faith, volunteers who maintained round-the-clock presence at the Johnson home and church. Both black and white residents participated, understanding that the attack represented a threat not just to Marcus's family, but to Oakwood's chance for meaningful change. Evidence from the shooting pointed to involvement by Gregory Simmons, the police chief's brother, and a former deputy who had been forced to resign years earlier after excessive force complaints. A regional manhunt ensued, with federal authorities coordinating with state police across 3 states. The attack brought national media attention back to Oakwood. Marcus, still recovering from his own injuries, gave a powerful interview from his church office, the bandaged cuts on Aisha's face, visible as she sat beside him. "What we're witnessing in Oakwood isn't unique to our town," he explained to the CNN reporter. "It's the desperate resistance of a system that has operated unchallenged for generations. The violence against my family is meant to silence not just us, but anyone who might be inspired to stand against injustice in their own communities." The interview resonated across the country, prompting national conversations about police accountability and systemic racism. White House officials reached out to Marcus, seeking his input on a police accountability initiative they were developing. "We'd like to model aspects of the program after your church's Community Oversight Committee," the presidential advisor explained. "Your approach balances accountability with community healing in ways other models don't achieve." Even as Oakwood became a national symbol for both racial injustice and the struggle against it, the manhunt for Gregory Simmons intensified. FBI agents traced him to an abandoned hunting cabin owned by the Pearson family. What followed was a tense standoff, with Simmons threatening suicide rather than surrender. As negotiators attempted to resolve the situation peacefully, Marcus arrived unexpectedly, having insisted on coming despite the obvious danger. "Gregory Simmons knows me," he told the FBI tactical commander. "Let me speak with him." After careful consideration, the federal agents allowed Marcus to communicate with Simmons via phone, while keeping the Reverend at a safe distance. "Gregory, this is Reverend Johnson," Marcus said when the connection was established. "I'd like to talk with you about finding a way through this that doesn't add more tragedy to what's already happened." Simmons's voice came back strained and desperate. "There's no way through, Reverend. They've destroyed everything my family built in this town. My brother's in jail, his pension's gone, all because you couldn't mind your own business." "Justice isn't anyone's business, Gregory. It belongs to all of us," Marcus replied. "What happens today won't change the past, but it will determine whether there's any future for you." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Marcus drawing on his experience as both military chaplain and community mediator. Finally, Gregory Simmons emerged from the cabin, surrendering his weapon and allowing himself to be taken into custody without violence. As federal agents secured him in a transport vehicle, he locked eyes with Marcus. "This doesn't change anything, Reverend. Oakwood will never be what you want it to be. Oakwood will be what its people make it," Marcus answered, "all its people together." With the immediate threat contained, the focus returned to the broader reforms taking shape in Oakwood. The FBI investigation had created the opportunity, but the hard work of rebuilding community trust would require sustained local commitment. As Marcus had told the congregation, justice through the courts was only the beginning. The deeper reconciliation would happen street by street, person by person, as Oakwood confronted its past and reimagined its future. 6 months passed, seasons changing as Oakwood underwent its own transformation. The trials of former police officers had concluded with multiple convictions, though some cases remained under appeal. Derek Pearson, facing the most serious charges, had made an unexpected decision. He offered to testify against his former colleagues in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony provided crucial details about the department's systematic civil rights violations, particularly the targeted harassment of black residents who challenged authority. "We were trained to send messages," he testified. "If someone filed a complaint, they'd suddenly find themselves pulled over every day. If they spoke at town council meetings about police conduct, their business might get multiple code violation inspections. It was never written down, but everyone understood how the system worked." On a crisp autumn morning, Marcus Johnson stood on the rebuilt steps of Hope Baptist Church, now fully recovered from his injuries. The church community center had been reconstructed with federal disaster relief funds and community donations, emerging larger and better equipped than before. Inside, programs serving Oakwood's children had expanded, with particular emphasis on building relationships between young people across racial lines. The police department had undergone equally profound changes. Following Chief Simmons's conviction, the City Council had appointed Oakwood's first black police chief, Captain Michael Robinson, a 20-year veteran who had often found his concerns about departmental practices ignored. Under his leadership, a civilian oversight board had been established, with membership reflecting Oakwood's diverse population. Officers now received enhanced training on community relations and implicit bias, with body cameras required for all interactions with the public. Despite offers of positions with national organizations working on police reform, Marcus had chosen to remain with his congregation. "My calling has always been to this community," he explained to Aisha, who had returned to her Atlanta practice but visited regularly. "The work here isn't finished." His commitment was tested when a call came from the White House. "The President would like you to serve as special advisor on the Faith and Justice Initiative," the Chief of Staff explained. "Your perspective on reconciliation would be invaluable at the national level." Marcus considered the offer seriously, but ultimately declined a full-time position, instead agreeing to serve as a consultant while maintaining his ministry in Oakwood. "The national conversation is vital," he told the President's representative, "but change happens in specific places with specific people. I need to see this through in Oakwood." The most remarkable developments involved Derek Pearson. After providing testimony that helped secure multiple convictions, he had begun serving his reduced sentence of 7 years. 3 months into his incarceration, he requested permission to make a public apology to the Oakwood community. The statement broadcast during his sentencing review revealed a man struggling to understand the system that had shaped him and his own role in perpetuating it. "I was raised to believe that some lives mattered more than others," he said, his voice unsteady. "I was taught that the badge gave me the right to be judge and jury. I cannot undo the harm I've caused, particularly to Reverend Johnson and to every person I targeted because of their race. But I can acknowledge that harm and commit to the difficult work of becoming someone different than the man who caused it." Community response to Pearson's statement was deeply divided. Many dismissed it as self-serving, an attempt to further reduce his sentence. Others, particularly those who had experienced his abuse of power directly, found it impossible to separate the apology from decades of harassment. Some, however, recognized in his words the possibility, however distant, of genuine transformation. Upon his eventual release, Derek Pearson would face a community forever changed by his actions and the system he had represented. His future in Oakwood would be determined not by words, but by the consistent actions of a man attempting to rebuild a life based on different principles than those that had guided him before. Marcus observed these varying reactions with understanding. As a minister, he believed in redemption's possibility. As a black man who had experienced racism's violence firsthand, he understood the deep skepticism. True reconciliation isn't about forgetting, he told his congregation. It's about remembering honestly and still finding a way forward together. The most powerful symbol of Oakwood's transformation came unexpectedly during a Sunday service 6 months after the attack. As worship concluded, Marcus noticed a figure sitting alone in the last pew, Gregory Simmons, recently released on bail pending his trial for the attack on the Johnson home. After initial shock, the congregation maintained a wary distance as Marcus approached him. "I didn't come to cause trouble," Gregory said quietly. "I came because I need to understand what my brother and his friends were so afraid of all these years." Marcus nodded. "That's as good a reason as any to be in church. You're welcome to join us again next Sunday if you'd like." It was a small moment, witnessed by few outside the congregation. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no instant healing of decades of division. But in that simple exchange, a man seeking understanding and another offering the space for that journey to begin, the seeds of Oakwood's future were visible. As Marcus returned to the pulpit to offer the benediction, he looked out at his diverse congregation, a community that had faced violence, confronted painful truths, and begun the hard work of rebuilding on more just foundations. "Justice isn't always what we expect," he told them quietly. "Sometimes it's the chance to become better than we were." Outside the church windows, Oakwood spread in all directions, a town where a single act of violence had exposed generations of corruption, where federal intervention had created space for local transformation, and where the long journey toward true community had only just begun. The path ahead would not be easy or straight. There would be setbacks, resistance, and moments of discouragement. But something fundamental had shifted in Oakwood, not just in its institutions, but in its understanding of itself. From Marcus Johnson's painful tumble down the church steps had come the opportunity for an entire community to find its footing on more solid ground. The story of Reverend Marcus Johnson teaches us that true justice requires both courage and compassion. It shows how systems of oppression depend on silence and fear to maintain power, but can be dismantled when people stand firmly in their truth. Marcus demonstrated that dignity is often our strongest weapon against hatred, while his connections revealed that power takes many forms beyond the obvious. We learn that transformation requires holding people accountable while still recognizing their humanity. Justice without the possibility of redemption merely perpetuates cycles of retribution. The most powerful lesson is that meaningful change happens at both institutional and personal levels. Federal intervention created space for reform, but the hard work of reconciliation happened through individual choices and community commitment. Lasting justice isn't found in punishment alone, but in building new systems that protect everyone equally. Finally, Marcus shows us that sometimes our greatest impact comes not from grand gestures, but from consistent, principled action in our own communities, creating ripples that extend far beyond what we might imagine. Have you ever witnessed how a single act of courage can transform an entire community? Comment below, sharing a time when you saw someone stand up against injustice and make a difference. If you believe that real change requires both accountability and compassion, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that speaking truth to power is always worth the risk, even when the consequences seem overwhelming. Thank you for joining this journey through Oakwood's transformation, and may you find the courage to be a catalyst for justice in your own community.